Hello, everyone. My name is Naba Rizvi, and today I'll be talking about my critical systematic literature review of HRI works. And this presentation is titled, Are Robots Ready to Deliver Autism Inclusion? So there are several different ways of understanding disability. One of them is the medical model, in which the individual with the disability is seen as the problem. So according to the medical model, autism is a deficit. However, this approach has several limitations. For example, it decenters community perspectives because it views autistic people from the perspectives of a neurotypical person. It also dehumanizes autistic people because it states that there are some traits that autistic people are missing, which makes them different from humans. And there are also a lot of social concerns such as isolation and an increase in suicidal ideation. And then there's power imbalances between the community and medical professionals using the medical model because it states that in order for somebody's autistic identity to be valid, it has to be validated by a medical professional. However, these are not the only ways of defining autism. You can also understand autism using the social model, which defines autism as a difference, or the identity model, under which autism is an identity. So there are two different ways of talking about autism. You can either use person first language, so that would be person with autism, or identity first language, and that would be identity first. That would center the identity. So it would be like saying autistic person. The majority of autistic people actually prefer identity first language, so that's what we're using in our work. Now, to give you some context with other theories, critical disability studies essentially tries to embrace this idea that of nothing about us without us, nothing about us without us. So essentially what that means is any research that's focusing on disabled communities should try to include participants from that community in that work. And crip technoscience just tries to challenge the existing social and power dynamics. So for example, neuronormativity, which states that there is only one right way for humans to think and express their thoughts. And if anybody deviates from that, they're abnormal. And using the puzzle piece to describe autism is one way of promoting neuronormativity because it views autism from a neurotypical person's perspective. So for the purposes of our work, we're using three different theories. Participatory design essentially is different from traditional design practices because it tries to include the participants in the design process itself to address power imbalances. Intersectionality is just looking at the intersections of different identities. So for example, a autistic woman of color would have her race, gender, and autism as the intersecting identities. And design justice just seeks to center marginalized communities and sort of promote this critical reflections. So our research question for this work is looking at what is the state of autism inclusion in HRI studies. And to this end, we're quantifying the marginalization of autistic end users. And we're contextualizing this using historical and contemporary examples, and also providing examples for more, providing recommendations for more inclusive future work. So for our search terms, we looked at autism, autistic, or ASD in all of the different robotics-focused conferences that are mentioned on this list. And for any conferences that didn't focus on robotics, so that would be CHI, ACID, CSCW. We also additionally added robotics in our search. And we looked at the first 50 papers that we filtered using relevance, and we looked at their abstracts and determined whether or not they focus on autism and robotics. And we ended up including 142 papers that were long and short papers, editorials, surveys, and demos. And from those 142 papers, we looked at the list of references from each paper and created our reference works corpus by including all of those reference papers. Our main corpus qualitative analysis was both inductive and deductive in nature. So essentially what we did in our first reading is model identification, in which the inductive portion was the study, design, inclusion, and proposed use of robots, whereas the deductive was disability model. In our second reading, we looked at intersectionality, and this is where we looked at the participant ages and genders. And in our third reading, we did an analysis of robots where only the user data collected was inductive, whereas the automation level, name, role, characteristics, interaction type, all of that was deductive because it came from work that's already been done in in HRI. So to give you an example of the deductive qualitative coding, for robot characteristics, roles, and automation levels, we looked at HRI literature. For example, the application area could be assistive robotics, where the role of the robot is a mentor, and the example could be it's providing social interaction for autistic children. And edutainment is another application area where the role of the robot is a peer, and the example could be the robot being a social companion for autistic children. So to give you an example of how we coded these models, we basically just filtered any papers that focused on a medical way of defining autism as medical model papers, and others were categorized under others, and that included papers such as this one focusing on understanding people's social perception of a robot, which would fall more under the social model. For our inductive analysis of the robot usage, we basically looked at all the different examples and consolidated them into codes, which were later consolidated into themes. So for example, for under the treatment theme, we had eye contact training and robot-mediated therapy. And from that, we determined skills training and therapy as the two separate codes, and we created the treatment theme. Our key findings show that pathologization is very present in our main corpus. In fact, 90.8% of papers pathologize autism, out of which the majority focused on treatment and diagnosis. And we saw this trend being replicated in our referenced works as well, where 93.5% applied the medical model. And we also found, interestingly, that the majority of works that were not from computer science, so majority of works cited from other fields, came from psychology and medicine. And that's interesting because they tend to look at autism from a deficit-based perspective. Whereas when we looked at the trends of the publication years of our referenced works, we found that they tended to peak in the 2000s. And keep in mind, this data has been annualized. And still, what happened is that in the 2000s only, we started seeing an emergence of more inclusive definitions of autism in the 2010s, but we're not really seeing those works being cited that often. To give you an example of the foundational work that dehumanized autistic people, these are two different papers in which both the authors are arguing that autistic people lack essential abilities that make us human. So as you can see from this example, they're applying the medical model because they're defining autism as a deficit, as opposed to the social model or the identity model, which look at autism as a difference or an identity. And so our tips for avoiding pathologization are basically just challenging neuronormativity, citing newer research, and considering alternative research directions instead of just focusing on teaching autistic people how to adapt neurotypical social norms. We also saw examples of essentialism in our main corpus, where the majority of participants were children and male. And this is interesting because the extreme male brain theory introduced in 2002 said that autism is just a presentation of a very extreme male brain, that because it focuses on systemizing instead of empathizing. And from that, we started stereotyping autism as being a boys' club. And we see this being reflected in HRI research, where in one of the papers we looked at, the author said that issues with aggression are common in children with autism, but this is not necessarily true because aggression is a trait that's more commonly found in autistic boys instead of autistic girls. So this is taking the perspective of autistic boys and kind of applying it to the whole community. And we see the same kind of essentialism with infantilization. In the 1990s, our view of autism was basically that autistic adults have a lower mental age than their physical age. So they're younger mentally and older physically. So autistic people lack autonomy and need more support was kind of the stereotype that we created. And we also see it in being replicated in our TV shows like Love on the Spectrum, for example, which has been accused of infantilizing people with autism. And we saw this being repeated in HRI literature again, where one of the papers said autistic people need someone to help stop them. So that essentially assumes that autistic people are unable to stop themselves and that they need to be stopped. Our tips for avoiding essentialism are basically prioritizing intersectionality in recruitment, research objectives, and data analysis, and avoiding ableist language and stereotypes. This paper from Botema Butel, we took their a sample of their paper, of their table, because it includes a patronizing language and suggests inclusive alternatives. So it's a really good resource for anyone who's looking to write more inclusive work. And also, we recommend reporting participant demographics to help readers contextualize your findings. So we observed several different types of power imbalances. One of them was an absence of the perspectives of autistic people, because we saw in 71.7% of papers, they were only included in the testing stage, so they weren't included in the design. And in 17.7%, their perspectives were not included at all. And we also saw the pathologization of their communication preferences once again, and this promotes neuronormativity because the eye contact data that was collected from autistic individuals in these papers tended to focus more on providing some sort of skills training. So it made the assumption that autistic people are lacking in certain traits. So the context behind this is that our society is very, very neuronormative. We already assume that autistic people are deficit in certain social skills, and we see robotics research basically reiterating that. There's also a lot of tokenism that happens in our research, because a lot of autistic scholars have said that if you just have one or two autistic people on your team, they experience pressure. And we also see a lot of robots being used to help autistic people become more human. And this is interesting because the foundational work that looked at autism compared autistic people to robots and chimpanzees. And we see something similar being replicated in HRI, where the more human-like a robot is, the more likely it is to teach skills to autistic people, whereas the less human-like robots, so these are the robots that look like animals or other machines, they're being treated as peers in interactions with autistic people. And we also see a lot of reliance on the medical field. So our tips to avoid power imbalances are basically just focusing on community-based research collaborations and reconsidering medical-focused research objectives, and broadening the inclusion of autistic people, not just in your pool of participants, but also in your research teams. And considering adding positionality statements, they don't have to be very detailed, because to protect people's right to privacy, but it does help. And also avoid dehumanizing comparisons, even if they're done inadvertently. Avoid comparing autistic people to animals or robots or any non-human entities. So now we really need to think about whether or not these ends are justifying the means. The effectiveness of clinical applications has not been supported by research. In fact, there is work that shows that it's counterproductive when you try to use robots to teach certain skills to autistic people, that they're actually less likely to develop that skill. And we've also found that even if we are successful in providing skills training to autistic people, it actually has a detrimental impact on their mental health. So We acknowledge that some of the limitations that researchers encounter might be systemic. For example, the funding, publication process, and marginalization of autistic researchers. So for a more inclusive future, we must address all types of barriers, and that includes changes in our research practices and systemic changes.